Go on. Tell him your name. The voice was loud, dripping with a false, beer-soaked friendliness that cut through the low hum of the bar. It was a challenge disguised as an invitation. All conversation at the crowded wooden table died. 5 pairs of eyes, all belonging to young men in their early 20s swaddled in varsity jackets, locked onto the one person who wasn't part of their crew. She was a woman sitting alone. Calm. A half-empty glass of whiskey neat sat on the coaster in front of her. Her hair was dark, damp from the rain outside, clinging to her neck. She wore a simple white t-shirt, gone slightly translucent from the moisture, and a pair of athletic shorts. She wasn't trying to be seen, but she couldn't be missed. There was a stillness to her, an intensity that seemed to push back against the noise, creating a bubble of silence around her stool. The one who had spoken, their obvious ringleader, leaned in. His jacket was blue and yellow, Hartford U, embroidered on the breast. He was muscular with the easy, unearned confidence of a college athlete who'd never been truly checked. Seriously, he smirked, his eyes scanning her up and down with a lazy arrogance. "We've been watching you. You don't talk much. You just sit there. What's your story? You a runner? You look like a runner. Or maybe you're just quiet." His friends chuckled, a low, sycophantic rumble. The woman didn't flinch. She simply turned her head, her gaze meeting his. It wasn't a look of fear or anger or even annoyance. It was assessment. Cold, dispassionate assessment, like a mechanic looking at a faulty engine. The bully, whose name was Chad, felt a prickle of unease but brushed it aside. He was used to people shrinking under his attention. This was different. He pressed on, leaning so close he could smell the faint scent of rain on her skin. You know, in the military, pilots have call signs. Cool names. Maybe you need one. Something tough for the strong, silent type. He grinned, looking back at his buddies for approval. "So come on. What's your call sign?" A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It didn't reach her eyes. She held his gaze for a long, silent moment, the tension in the air thickening like soup. Then, in a voice so low and level it was barely a whisper, yet it carried with the clarity of a gunshot in the sudden quiet, she spoke 2 words, "Viper 1." The effect was instantaneous and utterly terrifying. Chad's face, a moment ago a mask of smug superiority, dissolved. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving a waxy, pale mask. His eyes, once full of mocking light, went wide with a primal, gut-wrenching recognition. His jaw went slack. The pint glass of cheap lager he'd been holding simply slipped from his nerveless fingers. It hit the worn wooden floor with an explosive crash, glass and golden liquid exploding outwards, spraying the boots of his frozen friends. He didn't even seem to notice. He just stood there, frozen mid-snarl, his body locked in a state of pure, undiluted shock. The droplets of beer hung in the air for a split second, a frozen constellation of his shattered ego. One of his friends, a lanky kid in a similar jacket, had been filming the whole thing on his phone, anticipating a hilarious clip of them embarrassing the quiet loner. Now, his arms slowly lowered, the phone screen now pointing at the floor. His mouth was agape. Another just stared, his brain struggling to process the seismic shift that had just occurred. The quiet woman wasn't just a random person anymore. She was a ghost from a story they all knew, a legend, a nightmare. And friends, if you're new here, welcome to a place where quiet strength speaks the loudest. Stories like this are our specialty, so hit that subscribe button and join our community. You won't want to miss what comes next. The bar, the Rusty Nail, was the kind of place that existed in 1,000 American towns. It was a dim, cozy cave smelling of decades of beer, fried food, and polished wood. Dust motes danced in the slants of late afternoon light, cutting through the grimy windows. It was a neutral ground, a place for factory workers ending their shift, for old-timers nursing their regrets, and lately, for college kids from the university 20 miles away, feeling invincible in their Letterman jackets. Eliza didn't belong to any of those tribes. She came here for the silence, for the anonymity. It was a place to decompress, to let the static in her head settle after a long day. The dampness on her shirt was from a hard, cleansing run through the drizzle, not from any desire to be seen. She sought the corner stool, her back to the wall, a habit so ingrained it was instinct. She'd been coming here for 3 months. Ever since she'd moved back to this town, she'd once been so desperate to escape. Nobody knew her. Nobody asked questions. She was just the quiet woman with the whiskey. Chad and his fraternity brothers, however, were the antithesis of anonymity. They were noise and bluster, their identities stitched onto the sleeves of their jackets. To them, the world was a playground they owned. They'd been celebrating a win, some intramural game that felt like the Super Bowl to them. Their laughter was too loud, their backs were too. Their sense of entitlement was a visible aura. They'd noticed Eliza the moment they'd stumbled in. Her quiet intensity was a puzzle, and to boys like them, puzzles were either ignored or smashed open. The initial attempts had been clumsy. A raised glass from across the room, a comment about drinking like a man that she'd pointedly ignored. Her indifference was a fuel to their fire. It was a challenge to their perceived dominance. So Chad, emboldened by liquid courage, had decided to escalate. He'd swaggered over, his crew forming a half circle behind him, a phalanx of pure, unvarnished privilege. You know, in the military, pilots have call signs. The irony of him, a business major who'd never seen a day of hardship, explaining the concept of a call sign to her was almost laughable. Almost, she had let him talk. Let him dig his own grave with every condescending word. She had seen his type before, in countless forms. They were all the same, all bluster and no backbone, their courage borrowed from the herd. And then she had given him the one thing he'd asked for. Her call sign. Viper One. It wasn't just a name. It was a key that unlocked a door to a world he could only see in movies. It was a call sign that had been whispered over encrypted radios in the dust-choked air of a combat zone. It was a name that had been painted on the canopy of an F-16 Fighting Falcon, a sleek, deadly predator of the skies. It was a name that had been followed by commands, by affirmations, by the frantic, desperate calls of wingmen. Viper 1, bandits 3 o'clock high! Viper 1, Fox 3! Viper 1, your tail's clear. It was a name that carried the weight of lives saved and lives taken. It was a name that was earned in blood, sweat, and terror, not given out as a joke in a college bar. The silence that followed the shattering glass was profound. The jukebox in the corner seemed to have paused in respect. The old bartender, a grizzled man named Frank with a tattoo of an anchor on his forearm, had stopped wiping a glass. He was watching, his eyes narrowed, a flicker of understanding on his weathered face. He'd always suspected the quiet woman was more than she seemed. Chad was still frozen, his brain a cascading failure of systems. Viper 1. The words echoed in the hollowed-out chamber of his mind. He'd heard that name. Of course he'd heard it. Everyone who'd watched the news 6 years ago had heard it. It was the centerpiece of one of the most dramatic and heroic stories to come out of the last conflict. The story of a lone Air Force pilot, callsign Viper 1, who, against impossible odds, had taken on a squadron of enemy jets to protect a retreating ground convoy. A pilot who had been shot down behind enemy lines and had evaded capture for 3 days before being rescued. A pilot who had been awarded the Air Force Cross, the service's second highest honor. A pilot who had become a legend. And that pilot was a woman, Captain Alara Viper Vance. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a sledgehammer. The calmness wasn't aloofness. It was the stillness of a predator. The intensity wasn't social awkwardness. It was the focus of someone who had stared death in the face and hadn't blinked. The athletic build wasn't for fun runs. It was the physique of a warrior, of someone who had to be in peak condition to survive the crushing G-forces of a dogfight. He was standing in front of a bona fide American hero, and he had been trying to bully her. A low, shuddering breath finally escaped Chad's lungs. He took an involuntary step back, his shoe crunching on the broken glass. You, he stammered, his voice a broken whisper. You're her. Eliza didn't confirm or deny. She didn't need to. The truth was written in the absolute terror on his face. She simply picked up her glass of whiskey, took a slow, deliberate sip, and placed it back on the coaster with a soft, final click. The sound was like a period at the end of a sentence. I am so sorry, Chad choked out, the words tasting like ash. We didn't know. We were just, I'm sorry. His friends were a chorus of mumbled apologies, a wave of cowed deference. The phones were pocketed. The swagger was gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders of shame. They looked like little boys who had been caught torturing a kitten, and had just found out it was a lioness. Eliza's eyes swept over them, one by one. There was no triumph in her gaze, no smug satisfaction. There was only a deep, profound wariness. This was why she hid. This was why she sought the shadows. The moment of recognition was never about respect. It was always about this. The gaping mouths, the fumbled apologies, the awkward hero worship that felt just as alienating as the bullying. She didn't want to be a legend. She just wanted to be left alone. "You should go," she said, her voice still quiet, but now it carried the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed. They didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled, a messy, disorganized retreat, nearly tripping over each other to get away from the table, from her, from the crushing weight of their own ignorance. Chad was the last to move, his eyes still locked on her, 1,000 questions and a lifetime of regret swirling in their depths. He opened his mouth to say something else, but then thought better of it. He just gave a shaky, almost imperceptible nod, turned, and followed his friends out into the rainy afternoon, the shattered glass on the floor a perfect metaphor for his shattered ego. The bar door swung shut, and the normal sounds of the place slowly trickled back in. The hum of the cooler, the faint music from the jukebox, the soft clink of Frank putting another glass away. Frank walked over to the mess with a broom and dustpan. He didn't say a word as he swept up the broken glass, the sound a soft scraping whisper in the quiet. He dumped the shards into a bin, then leaned the broom against the bar. He walked over to Eliza's table and placed a fresh glass of whiskey next to her half-full one. "On the house, Captain," he said, his voice gravelly with respect. Eliza looked up at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She hadn't told anyone. Frank gave a small, knowing smile. "My nephew was a pararescue jumper. He was on the team that pulled you out." He tapped the side of his nose. "I've seen your picture. Took me a few weeks to place it, but I know." A genuine emotion, something raw and unguarded, flashed across Eliza's face for the first time. Gratitude. She gave a slow, single nod. "Thank him for me," she said, her voice thick. "Tell him, Viper One says thank you." Frank nodded back, his work done, and returned to his station behind the bar, giving her the space she so clearly needed. Eliza sat in the aftermath, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving a familiar hollow ache. The confrontation was over, but it had ripped the scab off a wound that never truly healed. She was back in the cockpit, the alarm shrieking, the smell of smoke and ozone filling her lungs. She was running through the dark, cold mountains, every shadow an enemy, every sound a threat. She was at the medal ceremony, the weight of the cross around her neck feeling like a millstone, the applause a deafening roar that couldn't silence the screams she still heard in her dreams. Viper One wasn't a badge of honor to her, it was a ghost. It was the name of the person she used to be before the sky tried to kill her. Before she had to kill others, the confident, fearless pilot was a shell, and what was left was this: a woman trying to outrun her own legend, finding solace in the bottom of a whiskey glass in a quiet bar. She finished her original drink in one long swallow, the burn a familiar, grounding sensation. She left the fresh one untouched, a tribute but not for her. Not today. She stood up, dropped a 20 on the table, and walked out of the rusty nail without a backward glance. The rain had softened to a fine mist, coating the parked cars and the pavement in a shimmering veil. She took a deep breath, the cool, damp air filling her lungs. She could see Chad and his friends down the street, huddled together, their heads low, their vibrant jackets looking dull and foolish in the gray light. They were just kids. Stupid, arrogant kids, but kids nonetheless. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for them. The weight of what they'd learned today would hang over them for a long time. She turned and started walking in the opposite direction, her sneakers making no sound on the wet sidewalk. She was alone again. Just a woman in a damp shirt walking in the rain, but the silence around her felt different now. It wasn't the silence of anonymity. It was the silence of memory. The ghost of Viper One had been summoned, and it would take time to put it back to rest. And for all of you who stayed with this story until the very end, who felt that tension and that powerful release, I have a question for you, a simple one to connect us all. From which part of the country are you watching this video? Drop your state, your city, your region in the comments below. Let's see how far the story of Viper One has reached.